Cabernet tends to be the sort of Errol Flynn of the grape varieties.
One of Australia's leading beer judges.
People always ask, how do you get involved in sake and how does that connect to music?
Because wine is an adventure.
Conventional winemakers who just condemn all natural wine as faulty.
The prestigious title of Sake Samurai.
Looking at whiskey in more of an artful culinary way.
The difference between getting good quality fresh hops, it just translates straight through into the beer.
This is the Drinks Adventures podcast. I'm James Atkinson, and this is the show where I speak to some of the world's most exciting producers of beer, wine and spirits and uncover trends and issues in the drinks industry today. Today on the show, we take a trip to Joadja Distillery in the Southern Highlands of New South Wales. Joadja has a story that is unique in many respects, not least its location among the ruins of a fairly isolated, heritage-listed mining town dating back to the 1870s. In 2011, the 1,000-acre property was purchased by Valero and Elisa Jimenez, who have since founded Joadja Distillery, a distilling venture that draws upon both their own Spanish backgrounds and the Scottish heritage of Joadja town. In a moment, you'll hear from Valero how it was that he and Elisa found themselves running a paddock-to-bottle whisky distillery on the site. As is the case for many Australian whisky startups over recent decades, Joadja Distillery may not have gotten off the ground were it not for the encouragement of industry legend Bill Lark. What I love about Australian craft spirits is that our distillers are truly free to experiment. We aren't governed by rules and traditions. That's why the flavour and character of Australian spirits is so unique. But it takes distilling prowess and another critical ingredient to bring these products to market, and that ingredient is Bintani. Bintani supplies distillers with malts of all colours, flavours and aromas. They have a leading range of yeast and other ingredients and the professional expertise to help distillers create the spirits of their dreams. Make Bintani your partner in taste and quality.
The first time we set foot here was probably almost 20 years ago. We knew the previous owner through an acquaintance and we fell in love with the site. It's just under 1,000 acres here, pristine bushland, a spring on the property and of course the historic site itself. And we knew that the previous fellow was keen to consider building a whisky distillery one day. We're talking 20 years ago now, but unfortunately that never eventuated. About 12 years ago or so, the fellow did in fact build a whisky distillery here before we bought the property. But unfortunately he went bust and we took over 9 years ago. The property was up for auction, public auction, and we were the silly buggers at the end of it signing a contract. And then, of course, the building itself was licensed or approved as a distillery, but there was no equipment, no water, no power, nothing at all. And local government suggested if we didn't operate it as a distillery, they could revoke the consent because this is a state heritage site and it was quite a little bit technical in terms of how a distillery could be built here. It's what they call prohibited use. But anyway, cutting to the chase, we very quickly acquired a still and some other equipment just to hold the license. And I can tell you in the beginning it was more of a hobby than anything else, but as time went by we realised that there were all these things leading us towards such things as the barley, of course the spring is on the property, true provenance if you like, and also doing it in such a way that would allow nature to dictate a lot of the characteristics of the ultimate product, which is of course single malt whisky. But yeah, that's how we came about acquiring the property, and now we're obviously well on our way to producing some interesting spirits.
You mentioned when we were talking off mic that Bill Lark talked you into the idea of doing the distilling yourself.
Correct, yeah. So when we acquired the property, we, again, local government suggested we better run it. They basically said use it or lose it. So I contacted Bill Lark with the view to get him to help us find a tenant. And after a few minutes of speaking to Bill, he insisted we make whisky ourselves. He said there are too many omens. Arguably, some of the best barrels for maturing your whisky are ex-sherry barrels from Spain. That's after he discovered that we happen to be Spanish. So I was born in Malaga, southern Spain, Andalusia, and my wife in particular, born in Jerez de la Frontera, which is where sherry comes from. So Bill said, if you can get these barrels in from your homeland, you're 90% of the way to making good whisky. And I thought, look, Bill, I'm really not interested. I'm looking for semi-retirement. I don't want to run a distillery, I just want to find a tenant, pay a little bit of rent for our semi-retirement. How good's that? He insisted again, he said too many omens. The sweetest of the sherries comes, of course, from PX grapes. Pedro Jimenez, well, Jimenez happens to be our surname as well, just spelt with a J instead of an X, but it is the same surname. And anyway, my ears pricked up. Next thing I know, I'm down in Tassie picking up equipment and setting up a distillery.
And what's happened since then? It's gone from being a very small concern to something that you were just telling me before that you really have ramped things up a bit in terms of scale as well.
Yeah, well, look, in the early days, it was more of a hobby. It was just to hold the licence. I mean, we were always interested in spirits, and we always knew the Scots have been using Spanish barrels for such a long time. We could see the whole synergy, the whole thing happening, again, at a very small level. We had a few headwinds with some of the bureaucracy, but that's beyond the scope of this conversation. The point is that that led to us wanting to up the ante, and we acquired a bigger still, 2,400 litre copper pot still locally. We also acquired a gin still, again, just to sort of diversify a little bit, experiment a little bit, but that was about 4 years ago. Then we start to, much to our surprise anyway, we start to win some awards and some recognition. And yet again, we then start to put down our barley on the property. That was about 4 years ago now. We start to get some recognition, we start to win awards, and then the rest is history. So the fact that people are appreciating what we're doing, of course, is very encouraging. And for us, I mean, everyone likes an accolade, and we're just improving our facility here, quality assurance, just pretty much everything, just really ramping everything up.
Now, you've obviously also started making paddock-to-bottle whiskey, which you've been able to do by growing your own barley. What was involved in that? What was behind that decision?
Well, look, everything here happened quite organically, not in relation to the barley, but in terms of how things came about. We were doing a tour, as you know, we do historic site tours as well as distillery tours. And during one of the distillery tours, a fella approached me and he said, look, why don't you grow barley on the paddock here where the orchard was? And I thought, well, look, I've been told that I can't grow barley here. It's not barley country. We're in a valley, not a lot of sunshine, too much moisture, etc. And he told me his name. He said, I've been growing barley in New Zealand for about 30 years. I can get you a crop here. And I said, well, look, come on down, show me how it's done. And of course, again, that was 3-4 years ago now. And so we put down our first crop it was middle of 2017. So it was 3 years ago now. And again, the rest is history. Low yielding, by the way, I have to say, we grow it organically. Now, this particular barley that we grow is not certified organic. Next year, it will be certified organic, and we're opening up another 12 or 13 acres, which will be certified organic. But the point I'm making there is that we really like the idea of allowing nature to dictate where our flavour comes from. We really believe that whisky is a spirit of place. Very much like the Scots, of course, you've got the Highlands and all the different areas in Scotland, and that you can tell anyone with a well-educated palate will be able to detect exactly where in Scotland that particular dram comes from. We want to make that statement here as well. Allow nature here to dictate where our flavour is driven.
You didn't seem to have a passion for distilling before this project, but did you have an interest in spirits?
Well, for me, not so much in spirits on its own. I was really fascinated by whisky. So really we are a whisky distillery first. Of course, we've diversified. But the point is, I remember as a child in Spain, and I was only 6 years old, and my father he loved his whisky. And I remember all of our lives, we would always discuss how the Scots, not always, of course, they get barrels from all parts of the world, but always fascinated that the Scots were coming down to Andalusia, the southern region of Spain, and taking all our barrels away. And I thought, well, hang on a minute, that can't be right. So again, that interest in finding that flavour, which is so unique to southern Spain, and marrying it to I'm an engineer, if you're not aware, I'm a civil engineer, and so that engineering background, and my son as well, and my daughter spent a year in Scotland, in Oban, in fact. So all of these things just coming together to say this is really where we should be. And we've never looked back. So to answer your question, yeah, I don't come from a spirits background, but in terms of understanding the flavours, access to arguably the best barrels in the world, and the engineering, everything just came together at the right time, like a little mini perfect storm.
Getting your hands on good quality sherry barrels is becoming more difficult by the day, as I understand it, and particularly, there's people talk about the issues with sulphur, taint, all that type of stuff. What's involved for you in being able to get, consistency of supply of good quality sherry barrels? Yeah, well, perhaps we have a little bit of an advantage in that being dual nationals. We go to Spain, we have family there, half of Elisa's family, my wife
work in the bodegas or the wineries there. So we have a little bit of an advantage in terms of being able to communicate with the Spaniards. That's first and foremost. Second of all, of course, is making sure that we educate ourselves very well in terms of making sure we can trace those barrels. That's very difficult. And so for us, it's really all about the story of where each individual barrel has come from. We haven't gone into any technical level in terms of having anything analysed with any sort of technology. For us, it really is part of the story. It's about people. It's about people, about honesty, about the story of where these barrels have been managed, understanding where they've been managed. Certainly, well, you mentioned sulphur. That is something that is always an issue, of course. We obviously make sure that we're doing everything we can to eliminate any possible, well, basically quality assurance, just making sure that we source those barrels and that we know where they've been. You may be aware that nowadays an ex-sherry barrel could be a barrel that's new. It has been maybe seasoned for 18 months or a year. That's still an ex-sherry barrel. And of course, that's not what we want. That's going to be a little bit harsh. We want something that's been maturing sherry. Well, when we talk about sherry, of course, we're talking about Pedro Jimenez or Oloroso. And now you've got other expressions or other sherry styles like your palo cortado, amontillado, and so forth. So these are all different things we can look for. But the point being that making sure that these barrels come in to us with at least 10 to 15, even 20 years maturing sherry is really what we're looking for.
And you tell me about those different, you mentioned those different sherry appellations or styles. How many of those have you got represented in your current array of barrels that you've got in there? And what are the different flavour profiles that you will get from those different styles of sherry barrels?
Sure. So at the moment, we've got Pedro Jimenez and Oloroso. So sweet sherry, which is the Pedro Jimenez, is of course all really about the sugar and the caramel and the dates and so forth. You're really going to get extraction of those flavours from that sort of barrel. By the way, these are all American white oak barrels that have been maturing sherries. Now, the PX is pretty straightforward. Your Christmas cake in a bottle is the expression we always use. The Oloroso is a little bit different. The process is a little bit different. The grape varieties used, depending on the type of Oloroso, because that can vary a little bit, but the one we use is 50% Pedro Jimenez grape, 50% Palomino grape, and the fermentation a little bit different as well. And then you've got your Fino as well, which we're going to play with. Let's not go there for a moment. Let's just talk about Oloroso and PX. That's all we're holding at the moment, but we're literally this morning put in an order for some other barrels. I'm not going to mention them right now, but we're very excited. We're getting some very interesting barrels from other sherry styles to experiment with. Fairly limited ones, we're not talking about huge quantities, but again, for us, it's always about learning. I will die here learning. So learning is what it's all about. And so we're going to be experimenting with other sherry expressions, yeah.
So it'll be 100% ex-Spanish sherry casks? There's not going to be any divergence from that?
Well, we do have some ex-bourbon barrels. If you're asking about our particular releases here, we do have some ex-bourbon barrels as well. But in terms of our forte is sherry, ex-sherry. It's part of our heritage as well. Now, look, we're not here with a big Spanish flag. We're not here to try and take over. We're just honouring the Scottish process. This was a small Scottish town here at Joadja. The miners were brought out from Scotland to mine kerosene shale, and that's the link between this heritage site and why local government and state government allowed a distillery here in the first place. So we don't want to diverge from that. We want to continue to honour that. But in terms of the barrels, our forte, ex-sherry.
Now, tell me about the new make spirit, though. I would assume that when you first started out distilling, you didn't have your own barley. What's been the evolution of that new make spirit? And are you sort of conscious of trying to bring out a lot of that character as well alongside that sherry influence? Yeah,
so of course, initially we would just get commercial grain, pale malt, as pretty much all others do. We didn't go for any peated expressions. We didn't really want to diversify too quickly up front. We just wanted to experiment, just get to know your stills. Because every still is different. In fact, these stills, you take them to Tasmania or Queensland, they're going to operate differently. So for me, it was learning about my stills. And so with the new make, the early expressions we brought out, I mean, we're up to release number 12. The first 9 were all commercial grain. Releases 10, 11 and 12 are the first of our barley. And of course, the first 9 expressions, the new make spirit, pretty much pale malt, fairly simple ferments, fairly simple in terms of how we manage that. I've got to go one step back. Remember, we're not geared up like a lot of the newer distilleries that have got a lot of very fancy gear. We don't have PLCs, we don't have data loggers, we don't have, even our mash tun's not jacketed, we can't do protein rest. There are lots of things we can't do here, and so for us it was always about knowing that we couldn't get that consistency, but using that to our advantage, knowing that every mash-in and every distillation was an experiment. And so we really, I learned a lot about the distilling process by really playing around with the stills a lot. The inconsistency in our earlier expressions tell that story. Now we're starting to understand where we want to go, so I'm really, really honing my skills and making sure I can get consistency in our new make. Of course, I'm not going to tell you everything. No. I'm no better or worse than anyone else. I'm just saying that I have my own style about how I do it, and we'll then start to get more consistency, but it really now becomes more about the barrels and how we manage the barrels. And of course, I have to say a little disclaimer here. Don't forget that not all our expressions are paddock to bottle. So there are, we can only grow so much barley here. And so in the near future, I can say probably 10% of our releases in the whisky range will be paddock to bottle. The rest will be, of course, commercial grain.
And there's not going to be a day where you'll have enough grain grown on site to be able to supply 100%?
Not on this paddock, because we only have 1,000 acres, but there's only really what you see in front of us today, which is about 23, 24 acres where we can grow barley successfully. We do have more properties up on the plateau, but that would involve a lot of investment. We do have some local growers emerging. We have a neighbour not far from here, literally 5 to 10 kilometres as the crow flies, who's putting down, I think, somewhere between 400 and 800 acres of barley, almost exclusively for us and maybe a couple of the local brewers as well. So that's going to be interesting. We still keep it in the Southern Highlands if we can. But to answer your question on this property, only about 24, 25, 23 acres of barley. Still get in the order of 10 to 15 tonne of barley, which is enough to make quite a lot of whisky, but not enough to make the full capacity that we have here now.
Sure. And you mentioned before that you would certainly be classified as genuine paddock to bottle. How would you differentiate that between some other producers that might say they're paddock to bottle but might not be able to claim it in the same way that you can? Again,
I mentioned to you before, the only step we don't do here at the moment is the malting process itself. We will soon, we are going to prepare for that, but we do everything from sowing it, in other words, I do it, me, the distiller, I put the barley down, I look after it, I keep the wallabies off it, I keep the wombats off it, I harvest it, I then send it, I actually physically drive to near Griffith, Voyager Malt do our malting at the moment, they process it or do the malting for us, I pick it up, bring it here, process it here. The only step we don't do, as I said, is the malting, everything else we do. Then the other thing, of course, is the spring. So the spring's on our property, it's not next door, it's not rainwater, it's not tank water, it's not bore water, it's not creek water, it's a proper spring coming out the side of the hill, water that's probably been filtered for God knows how many thousands of years through sandstone and other material, cleaning it up. Again, that's on our property. The paddocks that you've seen here are on the property, and I do all the work. That's what I would class as true paddock to bottle. Again, I'm not here to put anyone down. I mean, by definition, all whisky is paddock to bottle because it starts in a paddock. But when you're going to say paddock to bottle, it really should be your own paddock.
And just tell me about the release schedule, because you mentioned you're up to release number 12. Are we talking single casks or are we talking vatted releases?
Yeah, at the moment, certainly vatted. In the earlier expressions, there were one or two that were single cask. We did get some gongs for those. One of them was a single cask, another one was a cask strength. So they were single barrel releases. But now, of course, that was because of the earlier days were still fairly experimental. Now we're talking about much larger quantities. I'd rather not probably talk about the actual quantities we're putting down now, but we're putting down some substantial quantity of whisky. So within the next 6 to 12 months, we're looking at potentially dropping the release numbers as well. So what will happen is, and I'm just speculating here at the moment, that some of the expressions will be numbered, more than anything the ones that are paddock to bottle. And then, of course, we'll have a line which will be the commercial grain. Nothing wrong with that whisky. It's probably going to be the same. It could be better. But because, of course, it's cheaper to produce because it's commercially available grain, that will be more, not generic, that's the wrong word, but more our signature PX expressions, which is what everyone's after, that will start to drop off the release number, have just the signature releases being the paddock to bottle, and then everything else, no release number, just the quantity.
And that's just about trying to get a consistent house style that people can expect from those
exactly
releases?
Right. Yeah, so, so that's one of the things that, I mean, we don't want to be jack of all trades, master of none, but certainly we know that we want to be very picky about certain releases and say, look, this is what this land produces, for better or worse, and then you've got the other line which will be more consistent. So in larger quantities, we can do larger vattings that of course give us consistency over time. And again, most of that will be PX and Oloroso. So there'll be basically 2 lines, PX, Oloroso, and then you'll have the paddock-to-bottle, which will be smaller quantities, but in my opinion, they're the ones that are really going to be wanting to show off the paddock-to-bottle expressions. The barley here gives us, I don't think I've shown you yet, but when we go back inside, I'll show you the harvest from last year. We had a drought here, the grain not as plump as the previous year, but still able to produce quite interesting flavours and it'll certainly ferment right through, no problem. But the point is that, again, all of these different vintages, if you like, a little bit like the wine industry, they have their different vintages. We can sort of do a little bit the same, and it's really quite quirky the way sometimes you have a grain that has suffered. It's not high yielding, it's not ideal for us, but it will have slightly different characteristics than, say, a nice, big, healthy, plump grain. So that's where we're just really having fun with it.
With those releases, you want to celebrate those differences, don't you? So
very much so. So without mentioning brands, you've got some of the big whiskey brands that really succeeded in the old, a couple of 100 years ago, 150 years ago, succeeded because they could deliver consistency. For us, we found that we really want to stay away. Not that we don't want consistency, of course we do, and I've mentioned that before. We'll be doing that with our larger vattings, but with every year being different, look at the beginning of this year with the fires, and then we had floods down here. Last year we had a drought. That should be reflected in every year that we release new products. You can taste that in the product itself. It tells a story. Every dram should be a story in itself. You don't want a repetitive, this is the same. Certainly we'll be able to cater for those who really love our PX expressions, our Oloroso expressions. We can cater for that. But then, again, isn't it fun that every year you can say, oh, look, this year we're going to try this one because 2 years ago or 3 years ago or 4 years ago, there was a bushfire. You can taste the smoke taint from the bushfires, for example, etc., etc. So every release should have its own story.
This episode of Drinks Adventures is supported by Fever Tree Premium Mixers, the mixer of choice in the world's best bars and restaurants. Right now, I'm enjoying Fever Tree's smoky ginger ale as the perfect accompaniment to some of my favourite bourbons and whiskies. What's the last year been like for you guys? Because I know that you would have been definitely affected, your trade would have been badly impacted by the bushfires. And then, of course, we've had this next wonderful thing called COVID-19. So what's the last 12 months been like for the business?
Well, it's been pretty difficult in the sense that we do rely here fairly heavily on weekend trade. So the last 6 months in particular have been awful, maybe 7 months. So since December last year, 6 months, pretty much non-existent in terms of the trade coming to the distillery door for tours and tastings and, of course, purchasing product. In terms of production for us, it's been a little bit funny because we've actually, or I personally have benefited a little bit because given that I haven't had to man the distillery or the cellar door so often, it's given me more time to really plan things out carefully, tidy up some of our technology, for lack of a better expression, and also I have put down a fair amount of product as well. A lot of whiskey. Also, the gin's going very well. So in terms of my production, it's been good. In terms of revenue, non-existent. So I've been having to dip into our savings to fund that. And so we're just hoping, fingers crossed, that things, we come out of this terrible period ready to do battle and start to recover a little bit. But it has been pretty awful.
What's your distribution like outside of the cellar door?
Okay, pretty minimal. We've done that deliberately simply because we are really wanting to hold back. And of course, we're maturing a lot of whiskey. And rather than go out and really start to push when we may have some limitation in terms of some of the products we have, we're holding back. So we're still very early stages. I can tell you that within about 12 months, there's going to be a little mini explosion of Joadja products. So it has been deliberate. So we haven't gone out to the market very aggressively. We've been more reactive than proactive. So as we have been approached by some resellers and wholesalers and even distributors, we have sort of put the brakes on a little bit. We're very keen to do business, of course. We wouldn't be here if we weren't. But the lack of inventory has been a little bit restricting. And so that's why I can assure you certainly in the next few months, you'll notice us really starting to ramp up the visibility of the brand, brand development, brand recognition. Because look, our gin's doing really well. I mean, I'm going to give you a little scoop here, James. Late last year, the Governor of New South Wales, Her Excellency Margaret Beasley, commissioned us here at Joadja to prepare a gin as official gift of Government House in Sydney. We've already delivered that, and in fact, Her Excellency, the Governor, was here on the 13th of February to visit us with Mr. Wilson, and we gave her a tour of the distillery and a tour of the historic site, of course, as well. And that's a slightly different gin. We did that with 5 botanicals, New South Wales botanicals, not exclusive to New South Wales, but the botanicals, native botanicals that grow in New South Wales, plus the more traditional ones as well. And our own gin, of course, double medal winner. And I think we've only entered it into 2 competitions anyway. So the point I'm making is we are making products that people are appreciating. A lot of the gin bars are really fighting to try and get some product, and we're ramping up production with a new still, sort of upgrading our distillation capacity in terms of the clear spirits like vodka and gin and liqueurs and other things as well.
Your whiskey, when I saw the pricing structure, it was sort of up in that, premium Australian whiskey price bracket. Is that where you see yourself staying, or with this increased volume, do you want to try and have some slightly more accessible price products?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So with price point is really important. We are governed by the market. Our whiskey, again, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit unique. It's not the best in the world, and it's certainly not the worst. But for us, the fact that we had limited stock, obviously we can just keep that a little bit buoyant. Frankly, some of our whiskies, given that they're cask strength and they're quite unique whiskies, the price point that we've got them at the moment, in my opinion, is probably a little bit low, in fact. There is some scope for us, in fact, to even push them up a little bit, but I really want to keep a 1 in front of it. I don't want to put a 2 in front of a 500ml bottle, particularly cask strength. So to answer your question, again, it goes back to what we discussed before. Some of our, let's call it premium whiskies, the rare whiskies, because of the terroir and the provenance and so forth, there's going to be less stock, less supply. Obviously, the price is going to be held a little bit. But we do want to start making sure that we make our whiskies more accessible, because number one, we will have more stock that we can move, and number 2, we really want to showcase it. We want to let people know, hey, we exist and we can make really good products here, and we really want you to share it. So 2-pronged answer, we'll still keep pushing for high-end whiskey, rare whiskey, and keep those prices where they are. And then, of course, the larger quantities from commercial grain, the economies of scale come into play. It costs us a little bit less. We can pass that on and get more people getting to know that Joadja is here.
Fantastic. Well, I hope that Joadja is a name we're going to hear a lot more of in the future, Valero, and I know you're very busy today, so I better let you get back to whatever you were doing before I got here.
Great. Thank you, James, for coming out here.
Cheers.
Thank you.
The Drinks Adventures podcast is produced by me, James Atkinson, with additional production and mixing by Dave Robertson. You can find complete transcripts, links, and other information on the show at drinksadventures.com.au. You can follow me on all social media platforms at @ByJamesAtkinson, like my Facebook page, James Atkinson Drinks Adventures, to be kept informed of podcast giveaways and other news about the show. The Drinks Adventures podcast needs your support as listeners. Please do us a favour and leave an honest review and rating for the podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. We love hearing your feedback, and it helps inform other people this is a show worth listening to. Or simply drop us a line at hello@drinksadventures.com.au.